So Public Enterprises Minister Pravin Gordhan has announced that the deal to sell a 51% stake in South African Airways to the Takatso Consortium has been scrapped. The decision comes after the two parties failed to reach an agreement on the revised transaction structure. Gordhan says the decision took the public interest into consideration to ensure there is fair value to the taxpayer. Well, to weigh in on this announcement made by Gordhan, we are joined by Linden Birns, who is Managing Director of Plain Talking. Linden, good morning to you. Thank you so much for giving us time for a little bit of your analysis here. I mean, your initial thoughts at the announcement, of course, that deal now has essentially been terminated. We've got labor unions that have come out saying, hallelujah, this is great news. Your reaction?
Yeah, I think it raises more questions, frankly, than it provides answers. And, I don't subscribe to all the grandstanding that's going on at the moment. But I think, for me, the biggest question is, what next? Minister Gordhan says that the airline can survive for the next 12 to 18 months. Everyone had been sort of banking on the fact that so much political capital had been invested by the government that it wasn't going to let this deal fail. And now there's a question mark about where do they raise or find the 3 billion rand that they were looking for to fund, as working capital. Minister Gordhan has been very explicit, and so has the finance minister, saying that there'll be no more taxpayer bailouts, so the money's got to come from somewhere. Now, at the same time, we're sitting in a situation where our tourism market, our economy, trade and commerce is being constrained because we do not have a South African operator capable of flying intercontinental long-haul routes to the extent that we used to.
Yeah.
And under our bilateral air service agreements, we're not allowing at the moment foreign airlines to step up and meet that demand. But for SAA, and Minister Gordhan spoke yesterday about SAA having to develop a new corporate plan that would see it reinstate up to 40 routes and acquire long-haul aircraft. But that's a very capital-intensive exercise. And in the absence of money, the funding and the finance, we don't know how that's going to happen or when. And my question then is to the DOT, the Department of Transport, can we really afford to wait for SAA before we start reopening, our skies for travel?
Yeah.
Frankly, it's more important for the economy that we get people coming here and doing business here rather than sitting forever like we have been for the last 5 years, waiting for SAA to step up. The other part of that equation is that, if we look back 2 weeks ago, the Auditor General presented a startling and scathing assessment of South African Airways' accounts. And I think, more than anything else, that will have really rattled the markets in the industry, the financiers, the insurers, the lessors, the other big suppliers, because they'll have looked at that and said, this really elevates the risk associated with the airline, and we're going to attach a premium to any deals that we do with the airline.
Right.
And frankly, the Auditor General has said that's what they should be doing. Anyone who does business with the airline does so on their own risk because they cannot vouch for the veracity and the integrity of the accounts.
Well, help us then match that up, right? The concerning report that you get from the Auditor General on the state of the financials of SAA, and then the explanation that you get from the now retiring Minister of Public Enterprises, saying that, well, during the COVID pandemic, SAA was valued at 2.4. Post-COVID pandemic, it's valued differently. I mean, do those arguments then match up? Is that a valid argument to give us about why then we are seeing this deal being terminated, that a post-COVID SAA is worth a lot more than a during-COVID SAA?
Well, I think just to be fair, if you unpack what he said that, the initial valuation put the airline's business at between zero and negative.
Right.
And the valuation put it at around about 1 billion rand, which is not a lot of money in terms of, this industry, which really is, trades in dollars. But what was remarkable was that the property portfolio, he said, had risen in value from 2.4 to 5.5. And that's quite astonishing and raises, to me, that raises the question. I'm not a property analyst, but I'd love to know how they achieved that in a depressed property market.
Yeah. I mean, that's, again, you leave it hanging because it's a question mark, and I suppose that's where it sits. And one of the other questions then I have about how we, how we determine the value then of SAA according to, I suppose, the method that is used by Minister Gordhan. I mean, at this point, we're also just looking at the fleet that SAA just has, right? So let's talk about just its business valuation, the fleet that it holds, assets that it holds from that operational point of view, right? I mean, a big chunk of our fleet, I believe, and you can clarify that data for us, is leased to South Africa, correct?
Yes, it is. There are a handful of aircraft that SAA still has on its books, but they're not operating. They are quite old and they've not been maintained. They've been put into storage. They did try to sell those, but the market for those particular aircraft, there isn't a market really. I think they managed to offload 2 or 3 of them. That was about it to a charter operator in Europe. But the rest they're sitting with. And the current operational fleet is leased. So, those are hardly assets for the airline. There's nothing there, and they desperately need more. They've been struggling to get aircraft in the market and have had to go in what you call wet lease, which is hire aircraft with crew, with pilots and with cabin crew from Turkey. Yeah. So we've got those aircraft operating on the local domestic markets. But there's been complete opaqueness around that particular transaction and what the airline is paying by the hour or by the day or on whatever structure it is, however it's been structured. And that means, again, we've got locally skilled people who are not being able to who we can't put to work because those aircraft have come with foreign crew. Quite astonishing when we have similar aircraft in the country with local owners and plenty of qualified people to operate and maintain them.
Yeah, concerning. These are the calls that have been made by trade unions as a result of this announcement that the SAA deal with Takatso has been terminated. SAFTU, Zwelinze Mavavi saying, all right, the 10,000 jobs that were lost at SAA should be reinstated. Domestic routes that have been terminated need to be reinstated. This is, of course, after we've heard that SAA has expanded some of its routes into areas like Brazil, for instance. So just these calls that are being made by SAFTU, are those feasible?
I watched Mr. Vavi on your show on your channel last night, and I think he's being a little bit creative with some of the facts. He says reinstate the thousands of jobs that were people who were laid off to make way for Takatso. Well, actually, no one was laid off to make way for Takatso. People were laid off because the airline was put into business rescue and desperately needed to downsize, because its operation has been downsized. SAA today is 20% of what it was before. Its fleet and its network is, it used to be over 50 aircraft, and it used to have over 5,500 or 6,000 employees. It cannot sustain those sort of numbers on the current fleet and current operation. And you can't just simply say, reinstate the routes. There are the rules and regulations about how route licenses are applied. SAA actually still sits on a whole treasure trove of routes which is not operating. And that brings us back to my very first point. In order to operate those, it needs to be able to access aircraft. For that, it needs finance. For that, it needs reliable set of accounts in order to go to the markets. It can't do that at the moment. Yeah. I need to squeeze one more in, because I think that this is the question that a lot of people are thinking about as well as we hear about the termination of this deal. You've got someone from the Democratic Alliance, official opposition, who says the deal was bound to collapse because of the secrecy around it. There's been that big discussion around the secrecy of that deal with Takatso. I mean, what do you make of the secrecy? Right? Is it in the public interest that we understand what happened in that deal? Was secrecy
Was it well explained when he said, well, it's a live transaction and that's why there is all this secrecy around the deal? What do you make of that?
Look, it's important always to make sure that, you have commercial and competitive confidentiality. But I think at some stage you've also got to be able to take the public into your confidence and say, this is what we're doing. And the big issue here was that it had been opaque from day one. There'd never been any explanation as how, the Takatso Consortium arrived at.
Yeah, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for speaking to us, Linden. An absolute pleasure. And I suppose this will be an ongoing discussion. That was Linden Birns giving us an analysis there. He's Managing Director of Plain Talking.